Good evening. All right, good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody back to another class in the study of Apologetics. Last week, we began the truth of the second truth claim that we make as Christians. We've spent a few months now on the claim that God exists, and last week we began looking at the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then we are justified in being Christians, in being followers of Him. We began to look at the process of textual criticism, and the plan tonight is to finish up our material on how textual criticism works, and time permitting, we'll start on using the tools of textual criticism to determine which of the claims that Jesus makes in the New Testament are historical. Which of those claims actually happened? Which of those claims did Jesus actually make? Before we begin tonight, Jeff Walker is going to lead us in a word of opening prayer.
Lord, Heaven, thank you so much for this evening you've given us to come together and study your word and to learn more about it. Just in the day to take in the things that are applied, we just apply to ourselves and let your light shine through all of our life. And things that we present tonight, apologetics, but Kevin, give him the ability to deliver it and allow us to examine it and learn and grow from it. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Jeff. Let's begin, as always, by reciting 1 Peter 3:15 together. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. We've now studied 4 good reasons to think that God exists, and I think it's really helpful to have these 4 reasons memorized so that you can list them right off the top of your head when you need them. Somebody tell me, what's one good reason to think that God exists? William?
God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe.
Yeah, good. God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. Somebody give me another one. What's another good reason to think that God exists? Logan? You're hitting on one of them. The one you're trying to go for is God is the best explanation for the objectivity of morality. Morality is objective, and the best explanation for an objective morality is if it's the character of the creator of the universe. Who's got another one? Gabby?
God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning.
Good job. God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for life. And can somebody tell me, what is the last one? Selena? There you go. God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. These are 4 good reasons to think that God exists. And we also looked at the atheists' reasons to think that God does not exist, and the most important reason that they bring up is the problem of suffering. The amount of suffering that we experience in this world certainly seems to be evidence against God's existence. And we saw that when we tackled the problem of suffering, there were a number of distinctions that we had to make. First, we had to distinguish between the intellectual problem and the emotional problem. And then the intellectual problem needs to be distinguished between the logical version and the evidential version of the problem. Can somebody tell me, what's the difference between the logical version and the evidential version? Yes, Logan?
The logical version claims that two following statements are logically inconsistent, and the evidential claims that the suffering of the world makes God's existence improbable.
Yeah, very good job. So the difference between the logical version and the evidential version is in the logical version, the atheist is making the claim that suffering renders God's existence impossible, that it's not logically possible for both God and suffering to exist. The evidential version of the problem says that the suffering renders God's existence improbable, that God probably doesn't exist. So the evidential version is a much more modest claim to make. So the difference is impossible versus improbable. And we tackled these problems one at a time. Starting with the logical version, we saw that the logical version fails because the atheist would have to take on a burden of proof that is just too heavy for him to bear. He would have to show that it's impossible for free will to exist and that it's impossible for God to prefer a world with suffering over a world without suffering. And that's just a burden of proof that the atheist can't shoulder. Nobody can show that either of those things are necessarily true. So the logical version has failed. Nobody takes up the logical version anymore. Everybody now jumps straight to the evidential version, saying that God's existence is improbable given the suffering in the world. And because it's a much more modest claim, we're going to have to come up with a little more to refute his claim. And we saw three responses to the evidential version of the problem of suffering. First of all, human limitations. We're just not in a position to be able to make such a judgment that God probably doesn't have good reasons to permit suffering. When we look at the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is probable. We have to consider arguments for God's existence and weigh that against the suffering that we experience in the world. And then under Christian doctrine, God's existence is more probable. If it's the Christian God that exists, then it's even more likely that both God and suffering coexist. And so the evidential version of the problems of suffering fails, which then just leaves the emotional problem of suffering. And when somebody's going through the emotional problem of suffering, the thing that we can usually do that does the most good is just to be there and to listen and to serve and be a shoulder to cry on, so to speak. We can also reflect on Jesus' suffering. We know that when we look at Jesus' suffering on the cross, we know that God can empathize with our sufferings. He's not a distant creator, but he knows exactly what it feels like to suffer. And Jesus went through a suffering that none of us could comprehend. He took on the punishment for the sins of the entire world. And then the last thing that we looked at was changing our perspective. When we think about a relationship with Jesus in this life, a relationship with Jesus is beyond compare with any of the suffering that we experience in this life. So no matter what suffering we go through in this life, we can still say that God has been good to me. So last week, we moved on from the truth of the claim that God exists to the truth of the claim that we ought to be Christians. And to begin this section of the class, I asked a series of 5 questions. And the purpose of these 5 questions is hopefully to show us all logically, step by step, how we arrive at our justification for being Christians. And then that'll also help us show where we're going in this class and why we're studying what we're studying. And the first question that I asked is, what belief makes you a Christian? Because believing in God doesn't necessarily make you a Christian. There are a lot of people who believe in God who aren't Christians. So what belief makes you a Christian? Yeah, Selena? Yeah, belief in Jesus, and it's in the name, right? Christians are followers of Christ. They're followers of Jesus. So belief in Jesus makes you a Christian. Now that phrase is kind of vague, belief in Jesus. So then I asked the question, what beliefs specifically? What do we believe about Jesus? Just that he exists? Yeah, Anne. Very good. The truth of Jesus' claims is the way that I summarized the answer to this question. The specific truths that we believe about Jesus are his claims to be the promised Messiah, to be the divine Son of God, and to be the only way to salvation, through the only avenue to a saving relationship with God, and that he's the Lord, and that he's worthy of our lives. He's worthy of our service. And that begs the question, why should we believe Jesus' claims? What is the evidence that Jesus' claims were true and that they ought to be obeyed? Mason?
God raised Jesus from the dead.
Yeah, perfect. God raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead was God's stamp of approval upon all of Jesus' claims, all of his claims to be divine, and his claims that salvation is only through him, and the claims that he is our Lord. If God did not raise Jesus from the dead, then I'm not sure we'd have any good reasons to believe that any of those claims were true. But God did raise Jesus from the dead, and that is confirmation that all of his claims were true. And that raises the question, how do we know that Jesus actually made those claims, or that he rose from the dead, for that matter? Because the skeptic, when they look at the New Testament documents, no skeptic believes that the New Testament are bald-faced lies. Rather, when you read the pages of the New Testament, you can tell that the writers sincerely believed the things that they were writing. So what the skeptic has done is they've said that the truth about Jesus has been lost to history through legendary influence, that Jesus was nothing more than a good Jewish teacher. He never claimed to be the Messiah. He never claimed to be divine. He never claimed that he was the only way to salvation. He was just a good teacher. And then after he died, his early followers began telling stories about him. And then when the people who heard those stories told those stories to the next person, and the next person, and the next person, each time that story got retold, more details about Jesus got added into the narrative. And each time, the good Jewish teacher became just a little bit more divine, and a little bit more divine, so that by the time the New Testament was written down, the very good Jewish teacher was transformed into the divine Son of God. That's what the skeptic says about Jesus and the problem with the New Testament. So, how do we know that Jesus actually made those claims, or that he rose from the dead? Yeah, Selena?
It is recorded in the historical documents.
Yeah, good. It's recorded in historical documents. And I changed the answer to this one, so it's not going to match your notes anymore. I reworded it to the eyewitness testimony was documented. The reason we know in the 21st century that Jesus actually made those claims and that Jesus rose from the dead is because we read about it. We read about it in historical documents that were records of the eyewitness testimony of those facts. Eyewitness testimony of Jesus' claims and eyewitness testimony regarding the facts of Jesus' resurrection. That's how we know in the 21st century. But how do we know that the New Testament documents are historically reliable? How do we know that what we read in the New Testament actually happened? Logan? Yeah, textual criticism. We said that we can examine the New Testament documents using the same criteria that historians use to examine any other historical document. We're going to do a historical case for Jesus' resurrection from the dead. We're going to show using the same method of history that historians use for any other ancient document, that we have good reasons to believe that Jesus made those claims and that Jesus rose from the dead. Somebody tell me, why are we not appealing to inspiration and inerrancy in answering this question? Because I think when most of us were asked the question, how do we know that the New Testament documents are historically reliable? The answer is, well, no duh, it was inspired by God, right? There couldn't be anything more reliable than that. How come that's not the answer that I'm giving for this question? Yeah, Anne. Yeah, so the skeptic doesn't believe in the inspiration and inerrancy of the Bible. So when we're talking to the skeptic, it's not a good place to start. And there's another reason that I didn't actually talk about last week. Does anybody have any other reasons why we might want to do that, Ed? Okay, so this is the part of the class, or this material, that was most beneficial for me. You guys might remember that when I started having major doubts about my faith, it was because I began to doubt the inerrancy of the Bible. And my entire faith was balanced on the inerrancy of the Bible. And when I began to doubt the inerrancy, my whole faith began to crumble. And when I learned this material, I learned that even if the Bible wasn't inspired, even if the Bible wasn't inerrant, we would still have good reasons to believe that Jesus made those claims and that God raised Jesus from the dead. And once I had that foundation firmly in place, then I got back to studying the inerrancy of the Bible and was able to figure that out. But we're going to make the case that even if the Bible was not inspired by God, and even if it was not inerrant, we would still be justified in being Christians, that everybody ought to be Christians. And we can be Christians for the exact same reasons that the earliest Christians were Christians, by reading the eyewitness testimony of the people who were there in the first century, who heard the claims that Jesus made and were eyewitnesses to the evidence of his resurrection. And with that foundation and the belief and the inerrancy of the Bible, then we're doubly warranted in being Christians. Yeah, Ed?
We probably should point out that inerrancy and inspiration, what do they do for a Christian? Well, the question comes up, do we have what God specifically wanted us to know? And is it reliable?
Yeah.
Christian, that's a little different question than what we present to the world.
Yeah, good. So we're going to look at the New Testament documents from the skeptic's perspective. He doesn't believe that they're inspired, and he doesn't believe that they're inerrant. But we're going to show him that if we apply the same criteria as historians do to any other historical document, we can be reasonably certain about the truth contained in the New Testament. So to begin that investigation into the historicity of the real Jesus, we started to look at 5 good reasons to think that the Gospels ought to be considered reliable. When the New Testament critic reads an event out of the New Testament, like the feeding of the 5,000, his default position is that event probably didn't actually happen unless and until he has some kind of further evidence that proves that it did happen. But we're going to look at 5 reasons to show that default position is unjustified, that we ought to consider the Gospels reliable unless and until there's something that shows that they are unreliable. And the first reason that we saw to think that was that the Gospels are not analogous to folk tales or urban legends. When the New Testament authors wrote what they wrote, you can tell that they weren't trying to pass on folk tales or legends, but they talk about real people, real places, real events that can be corroborated through other ancient documents. Secondly, the Jewish transmission of sacred traditions was highly developed and reliable. We saw last week that first century Israel was an oral culture. The majority of their history and scripture was passed on orally. And so kids in that culture were trained from a very early age to memorize large tracts of information, and it was a skill that was highly developed among their culture. And Jesus' disciples would have taken similar care with the facts about Jesus. Thirdly, there were significant restraints on the embellishment of traditions about Jesus, such as the presence of eyewitnesses and the apostles' supervision. When the Gospels were recorded, the eyewitnesses to the facts were still alive. And so if people began telling stories about Jesus that added legendary details, the eyewitnesses would be there to correct it. They wouldn't let such legendary influence slide. And then the fourth point that we just had time to look at last week is the most significant yet. I forgot to mention that these are mostly listed in order of significance, and so we spent a lot more time on this fourth point. Does anybody remember what is the fourth reason to think that the Gospels ought to be considered reliable rather than legendary? Yeah, Anne?
The gospel writers had a proven track record of being.
Yeah, very good. The Gospel writers had a proven track record of historical reliability. And for that, we looked at Luke. We saw that Luke is a historian of the first rank, that he had the ability to write like a learned scholar if he wanted to, and that anywhere that his facts can be checked, Luke is always shown to be accurate. Any questions up until this point before we start new material? All right, so the fifth and most significant point of all is that there was insufficient time for legendary influences to erase the core historical facts. Some people say, how can we know anything that happened 2,000 years ago? And what such a person fails to realize is that the time gap between the evidence and today is not the significant time gap. The significant time gap is the time between when the events happened and when the evidence was recorded. And however long those have receded into the past from us today is simply irrelevant. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence simply because of the passage of time. So the question is, just how close are the sources for Jesus' life to the time that he lived? Well, the New Testament documents were all written before AD 70. So all of the information that we have about Jesus in the New Testament was written within 37 years of Jesus' life. By contrast, the apocryphal Gospels were written at least 100 years after Jesus' death. And it's important to repeat here that no modern scholar thinks that what's written in the New Testament are bald-faced lies. When you read the pages of the New Testament, there's no doubt that the authors sincerely believed the truth in what they proclaimed. So rather, ever since the 19th century, skeptical scholars have said that the gospel stories are myths, like stories of Robin Hood or King Arthur. As the stories about Jesus were passed on over the decades, they got muddled and exaggerated and mythologized until the original facts were all but lost. One of the major problems with the legend hypothesis, though, is there just simply wasn't enough time for this to happen. The time gap between Jesus' death and the writing of the New Testament is simply too short. Sources for Roman and Greek history are usually biased and removed 1 or 2 generations from the events, or even centuries from the events. And yet, historians reconstruct with confidence the course of Roman and Greek history. For example, the 2 earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after the death of Alexander the Great. And yet, historians still considered them to be trustworthy. The fabulous legends about Alexander the Great didn't develop until centuries after these 2 writers. So if historians think that something written 400 years after the subject had died is historically reliable, how much more so something that was written within 37 years of the subject? Tests have shown that even 2 generations is too short a time span to wipe out the hardcore of historical facts. All historians agree that the Gospels were written down and circulated during the first generation after the events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive. In order for the Gospels to be legendary at their core, more generations would be needed. And in fact, even when you add a time gap of just 2 generations, that's when we start seeing the rise of the apocryphal Gospels. And they do contain all sorts of fabulous stories about Jesus, trying to fill in the years between his boyhood and his ministry, for example. These are better candidates for the legends sought by the critics, not the New Testament Gospels. And this point becomes even more devastating for skeptics when you realize that the New Testament authors used sources that go back even closer to the time of the events. For example, the story that Mark writes about Jesus' suffering and death on the cross, commonly referred to as the Passion story, was probably not original to Mark. Mark probably used a source for this narrative. And experts have determined that the Passion source must go back to at least 7 years after Jesus' death. Another example would be Paul's letters in the New Testament. Paul, in his letters, passes on information about Jesus' teaching, the Last Supper, his betrayal, crucifixion, burial, and some of his information has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' life, and it just simply becomes irresponsible in such cases to speak of legends. So based on these 5 reasons, I think that we should assume the reliability of the New Testament documents. So when the skeptic has that default position that when he reads an event in the New Testament, it probably didn't happen unless and until he gets evidence that it did, that position is unjustified. For these 5 reasons here, we ought to assume that when we read an event out of the New Testament, it probably did happen unless and until there's some kind of evidence that shows that it didn't. At the very least, we ought to take a position of neutrality. When we read an event out of the New Testament, like the discovery of the empty tomb, we can just say, well, we're just not sure. We don't know if that happened. At the very least, we can take a position of neutrality. Any questions or discussion at this point? Yeah, Brian.
The key to number 5 here is this short amount of time that these things were written down in the New Testament. We've got to say these things fulfilled the things that were in the Old Testament. And when we look at the Old Testament, it was written over 1,400 years by 40 different writers that didn't know each other in 3 different languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Koine Greek. And when you combine all that with then these short amount of time that fulfilled all of that, you can't help but say this is accurate.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So Once we've seen that at the very least we should adopt a position of neutrality, how can we move beyond neutrality to the point at which we can actually affirm that some event actually happened? Well, historians have criteria for that, and we're going to learn about how historians use these criteria in order to determine the historicity of the event, or whether or not an event actually happened. And there's going to be 6 of these signs of authenticity, and after we talk about each one of them, what the sign is, we're going to talk about why it's a sign of authenticity and how that criteria works. The first sign that historians use is the sign of historical fit. The incident fits in with known historical facts of the time and place. And I think that the reason that this is a sign of authenticity is pretty obvious. The more sources that we have that an event happened, the more likely it is that it happened. If you have one person that wrote about an event that happened, like the cursing of the fig tree, you may not know whether or not that's historical or if that's a legend. But if you have 2 people that write about the cursing of the fig tree, that makes it more likely that it's an event that happened. And the more sources you have, the even more likely it is that it happened. So that's historical fit. Oops, I'm sorry. I just described the wrong one. I described the next one, independent early sources. Let me talk about historical fit for a second. Historical fit says that the incident fits in with known historical facts of the time and place. Again, the reason this one works is pretty obvious. If the events being recorded fits in with the setting, then it's far more likely that it actually happened than if it were to not fit in with the setting. Yes, Ed?
Perhaps an example is here, like if the Bible refers to the Assyrians, and then we study in earth history, archaeologists have discovered where the Assyrians lived, what kind of time period they lived in, and what kind of pottery they made. It all gels with biblical description.
Yeah. So when we read a story out of the New Testament and it fits in with information that we already know about that setting, it's more likely to have happened if we don't have any details that fit in with the setting. And then the second one, I actually already talked about, but I'll read it out anyway. Second one is independent early sources. The incident is related in multiple sources which are near to the time when the incident is said to have occurred and which don't rely on each other or on a common source. So the more people that write about an incident having happened, the more likely it is that it happened. And this is actually a really significant criteria when it comes to the life of Jesus, because how many accounts of Jesus' life do we have?
4.
We have 4, right? 4 good ones that are already collected into the New Testament. And it is true that most scholars agree that some of the stories found within those Gospels did rely on a common source. That Matthew and Luke, for example, used Mark as a source, and that Matthew and Luke used a document that's been designated Q. And so in those incidents, when they're getting their information from the same source, we wouldn't consider them independent sources. But when they tell an event in words and language that is different from each other and different from that common source, those are then new sources. So the fact that we have 4 Gospels that tell the stories about Jesus is really quite remarkable. Historians think that they've hit historical pay dirt when they have 2 sources that tell about an event. And there are many, many, many events in the New Testament that are recounted by all 4 Gospels. So independent early sources, although it seems obvious, and it's hard for us to wrap our heads around because we're so used to treating the New Testament like it's a single book. But we got to keep in mind that originally Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were 4 separate documents, and they were 4 independent sources for information about Jesus' life. The third criteria of authenticity is embarrassment. The incident is awkward or counterproductive for the early Christian church. When we read an event out of the New Testament, and that event contains details that are embarrassing or awkward for the early Christians, it's far more likely that that event actually happened. Can somebody guess? Somebody tell me why would that be the case? Why would embarrassment lend authenticity to an event? You got an idea, Logan?
Because if they're embarrassed of something that happened, then that means that if it happened, then they would be
Yeah, I think you're hitting on it. I saw another hand in the back. Oh, Patty?
It's like when the kings of old record their history, it's always recorded to make them look good.
Yeah,
So if you record something that's embarrassing, that doesn't always make you look good,
right.
but it shows that it's more accurate.
Yeah, very good. So remember, the skeptic is claiming that these stories about the divine Jesus that we read in the Bible are made up, that those details are not true. If someone's making up details and making up stories, are they going to make up details and stories that make them look bad? No. That's not the type of details. That's not the type of stories that you make up if you're making up things. So when we do see signs of embarrassment, when we do read details that do make the early Christians look bad or unfavorably, then it's far more likely that they're recording a detail that actually happened, not something that they invented. Yeah, Brian.
We have a kind of a poster child example of this archaeologically. It's called the Taylor Prison. The Taylor Prison records Sennacherib when he came to capture Hezekiah, and you might recall this when the angel came down and killed 185,000 of his men. Well, he in his annals that he wrote on this cylinder don't talk about 185,000. He says, "I penned up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage."
Right.
But that's all he says. And, because that he ruled his fate.
Yeah, if something embarrassing actually happened, and you're writing down history, those are details that you're likely to leave out, right? That you're gonna delete from what actually happened. So when you do see those details, it's far more likely that it's something that actually happened and not something that arose out of legendary influence. The fourth criteria that historians use is called dissimilarity. The incident is unlike earlier Jewish ideas and/or unlike later Christian ideas. So when we read an event out of the New Testament that's different from or contains ideas that aren't similar to earlier Jewish ideas, and they're also not similar to later Christian ideas, it makes it more likely that that event actually happened. And why do you guys think that dissimilarity lends to authenticity? Why is this a criteria of authenticity? Any guesses? Yeah, Ed?
I'm not quite sure if this is where you're headed.
Mm-hmm.
Different witnesses will record events slightly differently. And when you compare them, you would expect to see slight differences. This is one of the things J. Warner Wallace goes into in his material.
Yeah.
But gives you a degree of authenticity that you're really seeing it from several witnesses.
Okay.
If it's all common, then you begin to think, well, that's all derived from one source.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's not where I'm going, but that is a good point. Thank you.
They would record what they know,
Yeah.
not as what totally against what they think.
Perfect answer. People would record what they know, especially if they're making up stories, right? And they're making up details. They're going to tell things in terms of what they already know, in terms of how they were raised as Jews, or in terms of the belief of the early church. But if what they're telling contains ideas that are totally unlike either idea, it makes it highly unlikely that it was something that they made up. Rather, they're recording what actually happened. Okay. The fifth criteria that historians use is Semitisms. Traces of Hebrew or Aramaic language spoken by Jesus' countrymen appear in the story. So when we read an event out of the New Testament and it contains traces of Aramaic words and language or Aramaic phrasing, it makes it more likely that what's being written about actually happened. Any guesses on how this lends to authenticity?
Slang of your time.
Say again?
Slang of your time.
Yeah, the slang of your time, right? The words we use can actually really closely date us to any portion of history. And when the text that's actually used in recording these events matches the type of language that would have been used when those events were supposed to have been written down, it makes it more likely that it's authentic, that it's not a legendary late legend that got recorded hundreds of years later, but it's recording the events that actually happened and kept the words and language that were used in the original story. Because I forgot to mention here, in what language are the Gospels or all of the New Testament documents written in? Greek. What language did Jesus and his countrymen speak? Aramaic. So everything that we read out of the New Testament is a translation of what actually said, what actually was said. When Jesus spoke, he spoke in Aramaic, and yet we read the phrases of Jesus in Greek. That was the language that the Gospels were recorded in. And so when you see those traces of Aramaic, it makes it more likely that they're recording actual events. Yeah, Brad?
We also know that at least in some instances, because it's recorded, therefore it's probably more that they also spoke occasionally in Hebrew, as Paul did to the crowds.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. All right. And then the last criteria that we'll look at that historians use is coherence. The incident fits in with facts already established about Jesus. When we read an event out of the New Testament that lines up very well with information that we already know about Jesus through other sources, that makes it far more likely that it actually happened. And again, this is really similar to historical fit. Obviously, when the story contains details that match up with what we already know about Jesus, it's more likely to have happened than if it didn't contain such details. Can anybody tell me what is the difference between historical fit and coherence? Yeah, Gabby?
Historical fit is the facts about the setting, and coherence is the fact about the subject.
Perfect. That is the exact answer that I would say. I couldn't have said it better myself. Historical fit means it fits in with the setting, the facts about the time and place, whereas coherence has to do with the facts about the subject, the facts about Jesus. So historical fit is setting, coherence is subject. Nice job. All right. So these are the tools that historians use in order to establish the historicity of things that they read in ancient documents. And I want to notice three things about these criteria. First of all, they are all positive signs of historical credibility. You can only use them to establish the historicity of some event, not deny it. If a story is not embarrassing or dissimilar or found in independent early sources, obviously that doesn't mean that the incident isn't historical. So these are they're called criteria of authenticity, but that's kind of a misnomer. Really, they're signs of authenticity. When you're dealing with a source material like the New Testament documents that are ought to be regarded as reliable rather than legendary, these are signs of authenticity, not criteria of authenticity. Number two, these signs of authenticity don't presuppose the general reliability of the Gospels. They are applied to a specific incident, not the whole document. And they can be used to detect historical nuggets of information from any source, including the apocryphal Gospels or the Quran. These criteria of authenticity are not just what scholars use on the New Testament. These can be used on any other historical document. And then number three, in order to defend the credibility of some event, you don't need to defend the credibility of other events. So for example, if you're trying to prove that the account of the discovery of the empty tomb actually happened, you don't have to defend the authenticity of the triumphal entry or the feeding of the 5,000. If you're trying to prove that Jesus made some certain radical claim, like he claimed to be the Messiah, and the unbeliever points to some other claim that the Gospels record that they think is unauthentic, that just doesn't matter. We're not trying to prove biblical inerrancy at this point. We're just trying to show that Jesus made this specific claim, and it's simply irrelevant if some other claim appears to be inauthentic. Any questions or discussion about these criteria? So before applying these criteria to Jesus' life and ministry, it's worth noting a general problem that is faced by the skeptical critics that say that Jesus never made any radical claims. You know, the skeptics who say that Jesus was just a good Jewish teacher. We know that from Paul's letters, Jesus was being worshipped by his contemporaries as God incarnate within 20 years of his crucifixion. Open up your Bibles to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 5 through 11. Philippians 2, starting in verse 5. Paul writes, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Here in Philippians, Paul is talking about Jesus as if he's divine, and Paul's letters were written within 20 years of Jesus' life. So within 20 years of Jesus' life, Jesus was already being regarded and worshipped as God incarnate. And it would be inexplicable for monotheistic Jews to begin worshiping a man whom they had spent time with if that was not if he never made any divine claims of his own. Monotheism was the heart of the Jewish religion, and it would have been blasphemous to say that a human being was God. But this is precisely what the earliest Christians did proclaim and believe about Jesus. And so such claims must have been rooted in his teachings. Yes, Anne?
Well, not only that, but in a matter of days after his resurrection, thousands of people in the heart of Jewish civilization changed their mind and worshiped him as God.
Yeah, very good point. When we look at the facts in the case for Jesus' resurrection from the dead, that is one of the three facts that we're going to look at. The fact that the earliest disciples sincerely believed the claims about Jesus. That were, like you said, thousands of people in the very city in which Jesus was publicly crucified became Christians. Very good. All right, so now we've got our tool belt, right? We've got 5 reasons to think that the New Testament documents are reliable. We've got 6 tools of authenticity so that when we examine a New Testament event, if we see any of these signs, it makes it more likely that the event actually happened. So let's go ahead and use those tools on the New Testament in order to show that those claims that we talked about earlier are historical, that the actual Jesus did make some of those radical claims. We're going to look at 2 types of claims that Jesus made. First of all, Jesus' explicit claims. These are titles that Jesus explicitly attributed to himself. He claimed to be the Messiah, he claimed to be the Son of God, and he claimed to be the Son of Man. And then we're also going to look at some implicit claims that Jesus made. Jesus implicitly claimed that he did and said things that imply the same things as these divine titles. And those things would be the King of Israel, that he possesses divine authority and miraculous power, and that he is the judge. He is the standard by which everybody is going to be judged. Everybody's salvation is going to hinge on their response to him. So first, we're going to take a look at Jesus' explicit claims. And we'll go ahead and jump into Jesus' claim to be the Messiah. We've only got about 5 minutes, so we're probably not going to get too far into this. But I'd just like to introduce the subject tonight, and then we'll close. So we're going to show that the historical Jesus actually did make the claim to be the Messiah. Remember, the skeptical critic thinks that the historical Jesus never made such a claim, that he was just a good Jewish teacher, and any claims that we read in the New Testament in which Jesus claims to be the Messiah, those are only introduced through legendary influence. But we're going to show that the historical Jesus actually did make those claims. Before we do that, though, what does Messiah mean? Messiah is a transliterated Hebrew word. What would Messiah mean in English? Brian? Say it again, Rick?
The anointed.
The anointed one. Yeah, very good. Messiah means the anointed one. What does that mean? Who's an anointed one? What would? Yeah, he would be king. The Messiah is the anointed one, and the kings are anointed ones. And he wasn't just, the Messiah wasn't just supposed to be any king. He was supposed to be the Messiah, not a Messiah, the Messiah. First century in Israel had rekindled their hope for the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. He was supposed to be a descendant of King David, who reestablished David's throne in Jerusalem. And he was going to be king over all Israel and the nations. And he was going to be more than just a warrior king. He was going to be a spiritual shepherd of Israel. Does anybody know what the Greek word for Messiah is? Christ, there we go. The Greek word for Messiah is Christos, and it's where we get the English word Christ. And early Christians connected this title so closely to Jesus that it practically became a proper name, Jesus Christ. It was like his last name. The very term used to describe Jesus' followers, Christians, show how central their belief was that Jesus was the promised Messiah. But if the skeptics right, then Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, and Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, then where did the early Christians get this idea? Because Jesus did not reestablish David's throne in Jerusalem. Instead, he was crucified. Well, the best explanation is that the skeptics are wrong, that Jesus himself did claim to be the Messiah, and we do find such claims in the Gospels. We are going to look at 6 instances in which Jesus claims to be the Messiah, and then we're going to look really closely at one of them, and we're going to show how the criteria of authenticity show that there is an authentic event about Jesus. But we're going to have to stop here for tonight because we are out of time. We'll be out just a couple of minutes. Does anybody have any final questions or discussion before we close tonight? Yes, Brad. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yes, Brian.
And another one we had is when he was with the Samaritan woman at the well, and she talked about the Messiah to come, and he said, I am he.
Yeah, very good. And the examples that I've got up here are ones that Dr. Craig writes about in On Guard, and that he gives examples of criteria of authenticity that apply to those events. And so there may well be other events that exhibit those signs of credibility, but I'm just not well studied enough in the specifics to know them. Yeah. All right, go ahead and open up your songbooks to song number 68. In just a moment, Brian is going to lead us in Because He Lives. This song hits on the whole reason that we're studying what we're studying about Jesus right now. Jesus' resurrection is the vindication of his claims. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, we of all people would be most to be pitied. We'd be wasting our time. But in fact, Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he is the first fruits of the resurrection. He gives us hope that if we are in him, that we will be resurrected on the day of resurrection. So my question for you tonight is, are you in him? Have you become a part of Jesus' body? Does his sacrificial death apply to your sins? Are you in a right relationship with God? Are you in a saving relationship with God? If there's anything that you need tonight, I invite you to please come forward as we stand and sing.
God sent his son. They called him Jesus. He came to love, heal and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave
be seated, please.